Hey, Legal Rebels, this is Tom Martin. I'm the founder of LawDroid, and this is my podcast, LawDroid Manifesto, where I interview legal innovators about how they do what they do. In this episode, I interview Dr. Megan Ma, founding executive director of Stanford's LIFT Lab, whose early fascination with language has evolved into groundbreaking research that bridges the gap between AI theory and legal practice, helping define the future of how lawyers will work with artificial intelligence. Welcome to the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. I'm Tom Martin, your host. Today, I'm thrilled to have on Dr. Megan Ma. She is the founding executive director of Stanford's LIFT Lab, formerly an associate director at Codex. She is brilliant, and thankfully, I just got to see her talk at the Legal Innovation Conference in San Francisco. Megan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Tom. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, thank you so much. You're prolific in terms of like getting out there and speaking about AI and what it means for the legal world. And I think you do it in such a great, accessible way that, you bridge the gap for a lot of lawyers to understand and wrap their heads around what's going on. And just, I personally appreciate that. Thank you for what you do.
I really appreciate that comment. When I was growing up, I read a lot of George Orwell. And the thing I always enjoyed about his writing was that he actually touched upon really complicated subject matter, but he did it in a way anecdotally, and he also used quite simple language. And so I kind of took that as my approach that I feel like you can't really understand or you don't have an in-depth understanding of particular subject matter or whatever you want to share with other people if you can't explain it in the easiest way possible. And I think like a lot of knowledge, a lot of sort of that flowery language that you're taught actually in academia sometimes acts as a barrier to access. And I think like in our world today, knowledge deserves to be free. So it's actually an honor to me or like something I take, to heart. So I really appreciate the compliment as I can take it.
Yeah, well, happy to give it because it's true. And I think, the reference to Orwell, like definitely like if you don't understand, you can't communicate it simply, which it was Einstein, right, that said that,
Mm.
I think. But I do want to learn more about you. I know my audience does. You're currently working as the founding executive director of Stanford's LIFT Lab. If you don't mind explaining just what LIFT stands for and what your role is there.
Yeah, sure. So this is a newly formed lab at the law school here at Stanford. It stands for Legal Innovation through Frontier Technology. So it's the acronym of LIFT. And the idea of the lab is a serious focus around research prototyping. On the use and integration of generative AI for the profession and specifically in private practice. And of course, there's an additional dimension of legal education. I think how the lab, we see ourselves in part as a bit like a skunk works or, outsourced R&D in many cases for us to actually be able to bridge this connection between theory and practice. And so in the academic space, we often find that, there's a lot of really, really fascinating and interesting research that pushes the frontier on the theoretical side, but then how it gets actually applied for the industry often gets lost in translation. And so what we're hoping to do is workshop some ideas of what makes sense for the profession and then actually see how it could play out in practice.
That's great. I mean, it really closes the loop between the theory and practice and probably really informs the theory, right?
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, brought up academically by someone who I see as a role model. She was my PhD supervisor, and I've known her since law school. But Professor Horatia Mir-Watt, she was very, very interested in this idea of how does theory inform practice, and she was always doing that in every aspect of her own work. And so I probably took that to heart as I was like under her mentorship.
as my audience probably knows, I want to get into your origin story and in other influences you've had. Um, I know that currently you live in the Bay Area, right?
Right.
Did you grow up there?
No, I am a Canadian, so I will say I'm kind of part of the Maple Mafia, as they like to call it. And I know you are as well, Tom.
Yep.
I was originally from Toronto in the eastern part of Canada. And I think, growing up, I was everyone always says they were a little bit of a weird kid. I actually think I was probably a little bit of a weird kid. I had this strange fascination around language, even at an early age. And partially because I had maybe like a difficulty with trying to reconcile how words are spelled and what they mean. And so, say there's, the word giraffe, I just could not wrap my head around, why this particular word and the spelling of giraffe actually associated with the animal. And this is really
Okay.
different because, the other language that I grew up with is Cantonese or in Chinese. And when you write it, actually, it's quite pictographic. And so there is this association that was pretty clear. But in English, it was not clear. And then the other language that, I learned growing up was French. And so all these different languages, I started having like almost like maybe like a lack of understanding, which led to a fascination in how I put all these different linguistic pieces together. So, my reaction to this as a kid was I would just invent my own language or invent my own dialect and just started like going around and using it as if other people used it. And so, a lot of my friends like had no idea, and even still today my team often kids around and says that I have mechanisms in my manner of speech, and it comes from my childhood where I would just wanted to express myself differently simply because language to me was just so malleable because I could not understand how associations happen.
Wow, that's fascinating. Like at an early age, just having these types of, like almost epistemological questions about how we create knowledge and how things are connected and why words mean what they mean. That's that's pretty cool.
Thank you. I mean, only later on, I think, like I took my first ever linguistics class in college, and that's when it sort of almost put words to what I was feeling. That there was like difference between like the structure of language, like in syntax, and like then understanding semantics, which was
Mm,
focused on, studying the meaning of words. But that English or sort of these Latin-based languages naturally had what they call like non-natural associative meaning. And
yeah.
so the non-natural component just suddenly was almost like this epiphany where I was like, wow, all these years that I spent just like forcing myself to almost memorize and associate like how words are spelled with their meaning actually has a way of like existing in like a kind of like academic space. So I think that I carried that with me as well, and probably why I my interest in law started from a very again linguistic perspective, like what exactly is different about interpreting words from a legal perspective as opposed to just like a general, everyday natural language understanding.
It's also an interesting common thread that that kind of abstraction of language away from the natural meaning, like the ultimate is zeros and ones, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So where in Toronto, like, were you in the city or you were outside of it? Like, what was your neighborhood like as a kid?
Yeah, so I lived in a suburb about 30 minutes drive north of Toronto, known as Richmond Hill. And it was an area that was quite populated with minorities. Where I was specifically had a transition, I think, from a largely maybe Italian, first generation Italian immigrants into then Iranian immigrants. And then just to, I think, maybe about like a 5 minute drive, it was a very, very like um, Asian, Asian minority community. And so there was a lot of food that my parents were, familiar with, and a lot of food that, was, I think, very, I think, nostalgic, maybe growing up.
That's one of the things I love about Canada is that it's a real melting pot, and getting to have so many different flavors and tastes, and get to know different people is it's a fantastic upside to living in Canada. And so that must have been a great environment, like growing up, different people, different languages, different food, different ways of expressing yourself literally with language.
Yeah, I and it was funny because all my neighbors around the time when my parents moved there, they were all young kids, and I kind of grew up with them all with from different cultures. And then all of a sudden, it was like overnight, those families became empty nesters. So just as I went off to college, all of their kids went off to college, and so it was a great opportunity for my parents to then bond with other neighbors where they were all going through the same thing. And now, when I come back home, it's almost like the cycle has refreshed and the entire street is like littered with little kids again.
That's great. How about your parents? What did they do, or what did they do at the time?
So my parents, um, my mom worked at Procter and Gamble. She was in HR, and then my dad, he was a journalist.
Oh wow. What kind, did he have a beat? Like what kind of stories did he cover?
He was mostly in finance, but I think something I learned from my dad was that he really taught me the art of storytelling and the significance of narrative. And I think that's such an important part of the legal profession, actually. And so
Yeah.
maybe for him, like, I really understood not only questions of like, putting together something that could connect with other people, but also the significance of experience. And so my dad had, even as a young age, not only took us on like really kind of like wild family trips, but also that, he was always pushing me to go and see the world and experience something for myself as opposed to just reading about it. Because on the other hand, I was quite a bit of a bookworm. So his inspiration behind storytelling made me enjoy reading like at a young age. And I loved kind of like murder mystery type fiction and like, some sci-fi. And also like my mom created between the two of us this like book club, which I didn't even have like a concept of what that was, but she was like in finding a way to bond with me. And so we would basically, she would get books from all of her colleagues and she would pass them on, and we would have to like take notes. And she was like very rigorous about it. And so my dad was trying to get me out of like just this book club that my mom had
Right.
created and wanted to take me out into the world and let me have like and see things for myself. So I feel like these two sort of like quite different perspectives probably like brought me or raised me to not only enjoy kind of reading and like living through the text, but also like living in sort of like the real world and like being able to like capture those experiences.
Wow, those are wonderful memories and influences there. I'm curious, when your mom started this book club with you, how old were you at the time, if you remember?
I think I was about 6 or 7.
Wow,
Um,
that's pretty serious for a 6 or 7 year old.
yeah, like so when I was 6, actually, like the first sign that my mom was quite a serious, intense person is she like made me do my first ever CV or resume, like at 6 years old. And I don't have any experiences or credentials, but she was like, this is how you structure it. So come back and like tell me. She's like, you have to write your elementary school, what you did like in like when you were in kindergarten and all these things. And just sort of like put something together, and she was like, okay, we'll iterate on this. And then the next step was like, she set up this book club because, she wanted me to keep, a regular pace of reading, I guess. And I think for her, she found that there were certain books that she thought were maybe at a level that were, or like the subject matter seemed a little too mature for me. Like I was really into, again, murder mystery, which she didn't want to have those images kind of like color my mind. And so she pivoted me into more like classic literature. And then there was also a time where we were reading a lot of, I guess, quote unquote, girly books. Like it was,
Yeah.
there was this one series called The Amazing Days of Abby Hayes that, you know, my mom still talks about that book because it was like, it talks about this, young teenage girl that was like going through her life. And then she has all these little diary entries that share things from her own perspective. And so there's like a general narrator, and then there was like a personal narrator to the story. So like a first person perspective. And so she was really fascinated by this series, and we read every single book we can get our hands on with this particular series.
That's awesome. Especially the fact that you got to have that time with your mom and really, bond over something that you can like talk about conceptually, but also like kind of be there with each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you eventually end up going to McGill, which for the Americans, like stellar, amazing university. And I think you studied politics, economics. What was that like? What was that experience going? Because that's in Montreal, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So a bit of a ways from home. What was that experience like?
It was a really wonderful time. I think, I was pretty adamant about going there. I think my parents really wanted me to stay close to home. And so, they were constantly like, not necessarily to the point of bribing, but I'd say it was close where, they're like, yeah, you can stay close by. We have an apartment that we rent out historically to students at University of Toronto. So, it's perfect. You'll have your freedom. But, the freedom was obviously in quotes. For me, I think like I felt like if I didn't leave the nest at a sufficient distance, I wouldn't really truly, you know, I think start to become, I think, my own person. And not that necessarily in high school, my parents had any sense of being very controlling of who I was. It was just more like too much familiar to me was something that I felt like I was outgrowing, and I wanted something fresh and new, and to challenge myself. So I went to Montreal, and it was incredibly cold. I had to wear like two pairs of pants every time winter came about, or I just kind of found an excuse to stay either underground, since a lot of the city was underground, or to actually maybe have an excuse to not attend classes. But I think at my time there, I I was still really unsure, naturally, like what I wanted to do. I don't think that there was a particular area that I felt drawn to, actually. And I think back in the time, like I chose, political science and economics because, again, I was fascinated by this area of law. And a lot of people had said that these two subjects would probably be the most amenable to then going into law school. Um, but, the classes that are not kind of shown, that I took actually quite a bit of, was linguistics. And that really, I felt so, you know, captured by every single course I had. And those tend to be the courses that I ended up doing really well. But I was told at that age, this is an area that, there's not a lot of career opportunities, quote unquote, from linguistics. And so you should just focus yourself on political science and economics.
Mhm.
But, the economics class, some of them, I took from this one professor. His name is Christopher Reagan, and he was the most dynamic speaker I had ever met up until that moment. And he made something to me that honestly felt a little bit boring at the time really captivating. And that was, I think, enough to signal to me that sometimes, even if the subject matter doesn't directly, interest you, it's really about how you frame certain things that are able to get people to want to think a little bit more about the subject. And so I ended up kind of getting as well early experience, obviously in economics. You like learn things like econometrics, and then you start to learn more about like statistics. And so I think all of these things were pretty foundational. Ultimately, like down the line, when I started doing more work in NLP and large language models, but you know, at the time, it was just driven by the fact that I was not really sure what I wanted to do. I only
Yeah.
knew what I liked, but I just was told that if law school is in your any view, you should consider these two areas.
So let me focus on that for a second. Like, some people I talk to, in interview for the podcast, like some of them, know early on, well, wanted to go to law school. Some of them have no idea, and they're like, I need to make money somehow. I'm going to go to law school. But it sounds like you had a concept already of wanting to go to learn the law, but why? Like, how did that come up for you? What was that inspiration?
Honestly, it was a little bit comical, I'd say. Like I was about 8 or 9 and I watched Legally Blonde for the first time. And she has this amazing line where she runs into this guy that she wants to marry, and she says, and the guy's like, "Oh, you got into Harvard," and she's like, "Yeah, like it's hard," and and like that line always stuck with me, and I just thought it was really funny because it ended up being like this very, to me, inspirational movie that you don't have to change who your personality is. Um, you follow sort of like what you're drawn to in terms of the subject matter and then kind of build from there. And I think like, when I first started doing work on law and AI and, when I was writing my thesis on how to translate law into computer code, everything that I was doing in the interdisciplinary space was sort of viewed as like a little bit kooky, like mad sciencey, and no one had any idea where I was going with that. And, I stuck with it simply because all of this fascinated me. And I thought like looking back, like to maybe like sometimes I wish that I actually did my degree in my bachelor in linguistics rather than still focusing on poli sci and economics because, that was really what I was drawn to. So, yeah, so it's not really a clean answer, but put simply, I liked Reese Witherspoon and Legally Blonde.
Well, that's your answer, and that's a great one. Um, I I want to dig a little deeper on that though, because like for you, you chose to follow what your interest was, right? Not everyone would do that. And it doesn't have to be like a single thing that you could point to. What was there someone who like encouraged you that way, or just maybe by their form of how they led their lives, influenced you that way to follow that?
Yeah. So I think that person, just going back to what I mentioned earlier, was my PhD supervisor or Professor Horatio Mir-Watt. I always thought that she was such an inspiration to me because even in the days that I was in law school, she never once had a doubt that my sort of being different was was like something peculiar, or like she never felt like she needed to sway me in one direction or another. She
Mm-hmm.
actually always sought out opportunities that could uplift or help me deepen areas of interest for me. And for her, she has such an incredible story where she was in this area. So her specialty is private international law. And it has a lot of kind of these procedural rules, and it's kind of a, you know, pretty formalistic area to specialize in, but she's always done things differently. And in fact, she was actually one of the founding members of the law school in Paris, Sciences Po. And when she founded it, she came to a position where she said she did not want law school to pigeonhole people to being lawyers necessarily, or specifically even big law lawyers. And so when I heard that from her, and every time I hear her speak or what inspires her when she does her research, I think it just really molded me in many ways to feel like I could have the confidence to go and, explore what I wanted. And it doesn't mean that you won't fail and you'll always succeed, but that she wrapped it in such a blanket of warmth that this is what it means to live like a life of learning. And so I think that's really what drives me now.
What an amazing person to be, uh, exposed to, like to have that relationship with, because I mean, that's a bold statement for someone at a law school that you don't necessarily, like you don't have to be a lawyer. Like
Yeah.
it's a definitely like different mental model than we have generally in the United States.
Mhm. I think like maybe of course for her she's always been an academic, so maybe naturally she didn't feel that inclination necessarily to go into industry, but she does work with a lot of industry partners herself, and she, frequently knows like quite a few attorneys, and she works with judges as well. So I think naturally you would think that, she understands that there's this push often in law schools to like go into private practice. But for her, like she had this to me almost magical ability to kind of look at exactly what she thinks is your strength and find ways to again like help you make the best out of that. And she never ever like, there were all these moments in class where I feel like people would answer questions, but they don't actually answer the question and they would go on these long-winded tangents. And she had this like ability to just pick up that one kernel and make you feel like you have discovered a new thesis in life and that that was the best thing that's ever been said. And so, to me, like I always think about like my approach to things based on how she's made me feel confident um, and in her position as an educator.
And just to connect the dots for the audience, like after McGill, you went to Sciences Po where you met her. A little bit about that because that it's in Paris, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So actually, didn't immediately go to law school, and it was in Paris. I actually ended up taking this year where I worked at a pension firm because of the economics in my degree. I still had not totally known what I wanted to do right after. And so that year that I worked there, I guess I like discovered that that was really not for me. Um, and so I ended up, applying to different law schools. I once again, applied to University of Toronto for law school. And it was funny because I also applied to Sciences Po. And I actually got into both schools about a day apart. Um, and, my parents were super excited again. Um, thinking that I would take the University of Toronto route, but I talked this through with some of my friends at the time, and I had this one particular. She was also a mentor to me, and she, worked at the pension firm. And I had a chat with her, and she said, "Well, you're 20. Why not just take the dive and go to Paris?" And she's like, "Worst case scenario, you hate it and you come back home. Um, there's very little to lose here." And I think, like, again, a little bit of that sense of adventure that my dad had instilled with me at a young age. And then also, like, maybe I just didn't really want to stay home. And I felt like I needed a new challenge. I just ended up going to Snospo, and like my parents had held their breath, like really having no idea what I was going to do. And I actually met Horatia and Professor Mirwad my second day of class.
Wow. And it's there where you wrote the thesis, which kind of connected the dots between computers on the one hand and the law, right?
Oh, so that was the law degree. It was like a master's in law degree. And then actually, it was my PhD where I wrote the
Okay.
thesis around translating law into computer code. In my master's, I was still trying to figure out, what was of interest. And for whatever reason, I was suddenly drawn to medical malpractice as an area. Um, don't ask me why. I think maybe it was maybe the murder mysteries, like the kind of slight gore, or
Yeah.
like I think that that was kind of interesting. And also maybe I was interested in naturally like society's interpretation of like the role of a doctor and what it means to actually sue, a profession that people trust fundamentally, and what happens when they make mistakes. Um, so I think that that was maybe like something that was an area of curiosity for me. But really, I think there were two moments as I was doing law school in Paris that honestly affected my trajectory and why I ended up in technology. And the first one is I was working I was working kind of in for the Canadian government at the time, and I originally had applied to be in the Ministry of Health, but instead I was sent to the Ministry of Transportation. And there was a working group on self-driving cars, and I was obviously fascinated by it, and we got to work very closely with the California state government. And basically, there was this crazy proposition that we were going to this, have a self driving car from Windsor go through the passageway to Detroit. And
Oh, wow.
thought it was an insane proposition, even hearing it. And I was like, I would love to be on this team because I don't know what's going to happen. And so when I was working in that group, the thing that fascinated me was that people were listening so closely to every word that the California government had offered. They already had run through a number of tests, and the fact that we have Waymos here goes to show just how far ahead that the government was in supporting some of these companies that were developing those autonomous vehicles. In Canada, not only do we have like less of a relationship between industry and government, but also just we didn't have the technology anywhere near where California was at the time. And so I was reading through some of their recommendations, and the California government sort of focused on two. And one of them is about traffic lights, and the other one was about implementing these little reflectors. And I often talk about this story because I feel like it has so much to do with how we view risk mitigation today in generative AI. But in sort of the first instance, they had told us that with these little reflectors, these self-driving vehicles are going to be able to see the lanes much better. And so you definitely need to add those reflectors into the road. The second sort of suggestion was that traffic lights, you had to change all of them to LED lights only, because that's kind of like the type of lights that the cars could read best. And so they both seem like great recommendations. The problem is that living in Sunny Bay area, you'll realize that it's very different from having serious inclement weather, such as snow in Canada, especially since their whole big experiment was to drive from Windsor to Detroit.
Yeah.
And so what they just never accounted for is what happens when you have one little snowstorm. And so the first thing is that snow will cover immediately those reflectors. And so they virtually, whether or not there's reflectors or not, it doesn't actually help that much. And the second element of it was the traffic lights that we have in Canada actually emit a little bit of heat because they're infrared. And so the heat emission actually melts the snow from the traffic lights. If you changed all of them to LED, then you might run the risk of collapsing every traffic light. And so as a result, you can basically waste a whole multi-billion-dollar project to retrofit your infrastructure because you did not account for something like weather. And when I kind of walked through all of this planning, I realized that there's a sense that technology is made to be hyper generalizable, and you want something like that to be generalizable. But actually, real deployment and real adoption requires serious sensitivity around granular points that distinguish our jurisdictions. And I think that's like very much the case right now in legal AI, I would say, is that everyone is looking for that general purpose legal AI platform. But the things that will really build trust and have lawyers meaningfully use these tools comes from much more of an area of personalization, customization, and understanding how lawyers themselves add value, which comes from the individual level as opposed to this sort of like broader spread.
That's a great thread there. I wouldn't call it a metaphor, but it's a great way of explaining that connection between, the traffic lights and how, in a way, like generative AI should meet the lawyers where they're at with their
Mhm.
problems, with their situations, with their client relationship. Yeah, trying to change that in some ways it might lead to innovation, but in other ways it might miss the point, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like you'll hear all the time that lawyers feel slightly underwhelmed at times or really overwhelmed and excited. And the reason that we can't get this consistency is just because everyone experiences the technology a little bit differently. And so when you put a technology that is so malleable and infinitely sort of adaptive, you need to realize that like that's sort of the strength and the driving point. And so a lot of the work that we do has started to shift much more in this space as opposed to kind of figuring out, how do you do a top down approach of applying the technology to the broader sort of industry.
Well, this is probably a good transition point to get more into what you're doing now because it sounds like that kind of exploring things from the inside out is something you're doing with Love Lab. Um, can you can you explain a little bit about, let's say, your transition from Codex to Love Lab and how that informed your decision and informed your understanding of generative AI and its effect on the law?
Yeah, sure. So the kind of germination of this lab, and we're really new, such that we're about like 2 months old now. But I guess, motivation behind it came from the law school level, where the dean at Stanford, he felt that, this was very much a time where you needed to drive the law school to really understand this technology and the technology, like we shouldn't not only avoid introducing the technology to the students, it should be implemented at every level. And so
Mhm.
you're seeing a huge effort that is beyond the lab itself, this broad AI and law initiative across the law school to update the pedagogy, to think about how people can get access to those resources from the library. Or there's also opportunities like the lab so that the students can get their hands dirty with the technology and all of these different spaces. The lab in particular has, a focus around private practice. Of course, there's also legal education, but for us, what we were really interested in, and when I say us, I'm talking about myself and also the faculty director, Professor Julian Nyarko, was that we really wanted to see how this technology is elevating altogether access to high quality legal services. And so a lot of people, there's a huge access to justice problem, but I think part of the problem remains, really like undersolved, probably because we still don't have good metrics around what is quality legal work or what kind of work actually is, to some lawyers, fearfully commoditized, so to speak. And the analogy I often bring up is TurboTax. So when TurboTax was introduced, right, you didn't necessarily see a bunch of accountants like freak out about what TurboTax was going to do to their profession. But the fascinating part about TurboTax is it showcased that there are areas of work from filing your taxes that should be available to everyone. And it's easy to make available to everyone. But you actually get to a point when you go through TurboTax where you're like, wait a second, should I actually be consulting an accountant on this? Or like, I need to
Right.
consult a specialist. And it's actually making everyone else realize that we have our own limitations, even though technology is already getting us 70% or 80% there. And so that's to me how I see introduction of legal AI and offering technology in the legal space is it's clarifying for everyone what actually is the value add and significance of our profession. And until we really have better metrics around that, you're going to see, a lot of lawyers really unclear on what they feel could be commoditized and just a sort of sensitivity around what is high quality legal work or what is something that, is easily made available to everyone. And so that's kind of the focal point or mission around our lab is we want to drill in on private practice because we think it's almost like high tides lift all boats. And it starts from sort of like that 1% of, big law um, that really targets a lot of this complex transaction or litigation.
I love that. because there's talk about AI, like it could do the routine, so it allows you to practice at the top of your license, and it's kind of a truism that's thrown out there. But actually, how to tell the difference between the routine and the part that is uniquely human in that it requires
Mhm.
human expertise. I love your way of looking at it because it does distill it to, okay, clearly you could do X or you could do Y, but whether or not you should do X or do Y is not
Mhm.
necessarily something that a machine can tell you. Um,
Great.
so there's still a place for lawyers.
And I think there always will be. And this is just encouraging us to unlock maybe even workflows or areas that we never had time to tap into, or that like the technology itself like alleviates, a lot of the unnecessary cognitive burden that comes with, certain types of grunt work.
Well, the mission for the labs, like what are a few things that you have on your plate?
Yeah, so we have four pillars. One is on evaluation, one is on AI to augment legal services, and one is for legal education and professional development. And the last one is on what we loosely call methods or new types of methods. Um, Going just sort of in order, evaluation. I mentioned this sort of briefly at Legal Innovators, but we've been working a lot on targeting this question of what's the sort of baseline around human work, and how do we kind of measure machine performance against the human baseline? And then we kind of have a better benchmark so that we can then optimize our models towards that criteria as opposed to sort of like a little bit more objective criteria, such as like, accuracy, comprehensiveness, completeness. And so we have this study that we put out there where we tested, mid-level associates against off-the-shelf models and enterprise tools. And we gave them to senior partners to give us their preference ratings. And that's where we uncovered that actually there's quite a bit of work where um, our human associates had underperformed in comparison to these tools. But the funny part about it is that we gave a lot of grace to the humans, where you don't necessarily know why they didn't give 100% to the work. I think the other side of that was it started to reveal a lot of subjective criteria that senior lawyers care about, such as, advocacy, coherence of the argument, all of these things that we will eventually think about as we build better benchmarks for our tools. And so that's one area that we're continuing to work on. And our study, we only focused on litigation, so we're expanding it to transaction and other areas of legal work. And then with the AI to augment legal services, this area is so far, much more of Julian Nyarko's work. He's looking at kind of um, how can we add additional value to our tools that we're offering? So if you're doing contract analysis or creating a contract redlining tool, it's not just about sort of optimizing your playbooks with one another. Can you, like, for example, give signals such as, oh, the way that you're framing this contractual language often actually leads to misinterpretation, and therefore potentially dispute resolution is on the horizon for you. And so if you want to lower your probability of going to court or having to settle or whatnot, then you might want to consider reframing the potential language. And so he started doing a bunch of research on tethering contractual language to litigation, and seeing how those insights can be integrated in some of the tools that we're building. Third area, of course, that I often talk to no end about is the legal education side. So we have a lot of work on how do we train our law students all the way to kind of junior associates, and as they kind of grow, get out of their sea legs into the profession. And so we've built, for example, Deal Mentor, which is our M&A negotiation simulator. We also have a whole number of other tools, but we're focused on kind of how do you scale experiential training, basically.
That's a big plate. That's a lot of stuff. Um, and actually, it sounds like it could be, the rest of your career focusing on those things. Um, but definitely, like number one, the first one, It's definitely needed because that's entirely missing. There's a lot of criticism that's made sometimes about generative AI and how it falls short in some circumstances, hallucinations, and other things. But it doesn't really make sense in a vacuum. You have to look at how human beings are, performing themselves and then having a benchmark for that against how any technology is performing. Uh, you have to have a larger view of things. Um, well, I could definitely see how, like things have definitely changed since the launch of ChatGPT. Like the way that things have gone more in depth and more in depth and become more concrete and real for us. I think the work that you're doing is amazing because it's going to be leading the forefront, the frontier, as is mentioned in the lab, um, of how we actually put this into practice. Because that's the big question, right? Is like as we move forward, how will we work with AI? A lot of times people worry about losing their job or not having as much work to do in the future. Based upon the work you've done so far, it sounds like you definitely think there's still a place for lawyers, but do you think what defines lawyers is going to change?
I I definitely think so. I mean, historically, this is one of those professions where, you know, put in a not so gentle light, people say, legal services is like the credence good, right? You don't really know exactly what you're paying for. But I think the perception of what the lawyer and the broader legal profession has to offer can be much more empirically driven going forward. I think it's one of those professions that right now you still sort of like put where you went to school, how well what the size of the deals that you can bring in, what are the high profile cases that you work on. And these are kind of very loose, vague metrics, and they're very, very reputation driven. And of course, like everyone wants to trust their legal advisors to have kind of a wonderful reputation and proven track record, but it never hurts to put some numbers or additional metrics onto it. And I think like that's what's going to be a distinguishing factor going forward. Is it's not just about who they were in law school, so to speak, or like what um, deals that they have locked in, but actually kind of what is significant about their insights and going through those types of deals that could really, offer you the best outcome, for example, as a client.
Well, I think that's great. Law is becoming data driven for sure.
And I
Well,
mean, like, this has been said for a very long time, or like at least the hopes of it, but I truly feel like we're in this moment now.
with that, let me ask you a couple questions I ask all of my guests. The first one is just kind of for the benefit of the audience. How do they get everything done? How do you get everything done? You have many irons in the fire. You got a lot on your plate in terms of the research and work that you're going to do as the founding executive director there. How do you get it done? Is there such a thing as work-life balance, or is that a myth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I mean, something that I guess a lot of people already know. I'm expecting my first baby in a couple months, and I've been thinking a lot about this question of work life balance. And I think sometimes it's much more about the support system that you surround yourself with, um, in addition to kind of why you're doing the work that you do. So for me, I'm really lucky to have husband, a partner who um, makes me feel like I could do all of it, and that, I don't necessarily have to delineate things as clearly as like, this is where I can turn off my brain, so to speak, and like set aside the work. And this is when it's family. I think he has a very clear understanding that for me, the work is not just a job, so to speak. The work to me is like, everything comes from an area that's totally passion driven, almost like right now my focus 100%, or not 100%, but a lot of it is driven by how do I train the next generation of lawyers and like what's coming for this profession. And I do this work not because, I get the paycheck for it. The paycheck is fine and all dandy and well, but I I feel like if I don't do the work that we're going to genuinely fall behind on it. And I want to make sure that everyone who is interested in this space, we can all continue to push that frontier together. Um, I think, being an academic, I always say that like you can't really turn your brain off so
Mhm.
easily. Like you're always thinking about these things. And certainly, we don't get paid enough necessarily to feel like that's our motivating factor. If that was, then we wouldn't necessarily be in this profession. So yeah, I think like maybe not necessarily that it's a myth, but that you have to create, a supportive ecosystem in order to make all of this happen.
Well, I think those are really great words of wisdom, which kind of leads to the second and last question that I have for you, which is after doing all of this, there's a lot going on, and what makes it worthwhile for you at the end of the day?
Yeah, I love that question. To me, it's worthwhile because even just a small example that we've been experimenting with Deal Mentor. We both deployed it, at law firms and we're testing, the effectiveness of using these simulation AI tools for training. But in a couple of sort of small anecdotal points where we got to play out Deal Mentor to some law students, in one of my classes that I taught, the class stayed behind for a full half hour and they just could not stop going through different negotiation scenarios. And to me, it was not only extremely gratifying, it was like just amazing seeing a generation that could tap into how gamification is actually really potentially useful and a great way of challenging themselves. And we had students afterwards like asking like, oh, when can I get access to the tool, because I feel like, I'm actually playing out some of the material that I had read.
Hmm.
And to me, like going back to some of like my earliest memories, as I shared, I almost felt like I was doing what my parents had done, where it was like I tethered the text and being able to live through the text with something that was experiential so that they can see it and live it. Um, and so why it's meaningful to me is like I genuinely feel like it's long overdue how we teach one another. And especially for the legal profession, it's just been, you know, primarily focused on really great aspects of mentorship and apprenticeship, but there was no way of evaluating that, or there was no way of scaling it, or no way of kind of collecting each other's experiences and actually doing that type of knowledge sharing. And now we actually have the opportunity to potentially do that.
That's amazing, and I so look forward to seeing your work and your continued work on this because you're right. It's so much needed, and I feel confident that with someone like yourself working on it, that it'll be a brighter future for everyone.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tom. And this is fun. I hope I didn't stray off into too much oversharing, but yeah.
No, not at all. In fact, like your story is amazing in terms of uh, your early interest in linguistics and like large language models and computers and like it all fits together, and especially with the lessons learned from your parents and how you're actualizing that with students now, I think is fantastic. And I want to thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Tom. This was really fun.
For those that are listening and watching, how can they keep in touch with you?
So we're you can definitely, add me on LinkedIn if you'd like to kind of reach out to me, or my email is sort of public knowledge. So you just have to look up my profile in Stanford. But the Lift Lab, we actually have a landing page now for the lab finally. But the full website is coming end of August.
Awesome. And for everyone out there, thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. To keep in the loop about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to LawDroid Manifesto and you'll get notified. Thanks for watching. See you next time.